We are faced with an increasingly rapid accumulation of factors of uncertainty, which are echoed day after day in the media. It's as if a spiral has been set in motion, fraught with threats that we know how to identify, but which societies and states, tossed from one contradictory injunction to another, are unable to control. Faced with the onset of a regime of generalized uncertainty, worries are on the rise, while, as always in such situations, doomsayers, fearmongers, and other exploiters of anxiety thrive. Uncertainty is compounded by temporal disorientation, which itself generates or reinforces uncertainty. Always add human communities to confront the opacity of their presence. In order to decide what to do, how to act, the production of narratives making sense of past events was an option to shed light on the present. We were then in the world of the Historia Magistrae Vitae, where one looked first in direction of the past in order to find out examples to imitate and lessons to meditate. When, around the end of the 18th century, modern times take the lead, the future becomes the main category, and the light, so to speak, comes from the future. In this reversal of the previous configurations, the lessons come from the future. History, singular and with capital H, become the great deity of a world invited or pressed to march faster and faster towards some radiant future. But when around the 1960s and 70s, for various reasons, the light coming from the future fades away, the present remained the only available category. We enter, in Europe or even in the West, what I have called Presentism. The formula of the modern regime of historicity has been given by Tocqueville at the end of Democracy in America. He says, when the past no longer illuminates the future, the mind walks in darkness. With these few words, he acknowledges the end of the old regime, of the ancient regime of historicity, and at the same time defines the modern one. It is now up to the future to illuminate the past and the present. It was from the future, in his case, from America, where he had traveled, that the meaning of history was illuminated. The disappearance in the 60s and 70s of the modern regime of historicity, focused on the future and driven by progress, has opened up a space for presentism, and at the same time, for a multitude of discordant and concomitant temporalities. The growing individualization of time is one manifestation of this. My time is not your time, even if we share the immediacy of email and the same smartphones. The situation can be described as one of generalized discordance, with all the accompanying effects of unlinkage, including social unlinkage. If divine eternity was defined as tota simul, all at once, presentism would be something like an eternity of the instant, everything at once, at every moment. A simultaneity of the simultaneous that is both evanescent and perpetual, of which 20-hour news channels and social networks are both the fuel and the product. The web is a temporal babel. The success of the expression in real time, which accompanied the information revolution, referred to and valued simultaneity and instantaneity. Real time in the time of stock markets and financial transactions, where the nanosecond has become almost the norm. From my present, everything, everywhere, and at any time must be accessible online with just a few clicks. Recently, however, this Babylonian presentism, closing on itself and forming a bubble, has been hit by a new time, the Anthropocene, with its specific temporalities. By this term, we mean, as you know, a new geological epoch following the Holocene, which will have lasted, or is thought to have lasted, less than 12,000 years. The new phenomenon that the Anthropocene was intended to designate is that humanity, as a species, had become a geological force whose impact could be measured from stratigraphic records. For while humans have always affected their environment, it's only since the great acceleration of the 1950s that the effects of their action have grown exponentially to the point of altering the Earth system itself. According to historian John McNeill, we have embarked on, I quote, an experiment on Earth that we have no control over. So much so that presentism, accustomed to seeing nothing beyond itself, has suddenly found itself confronted with an immense past and future, which are those of the Earth. Presentism used to live under a regime of urgency, delay, acceleration, and disasters, large and small, that follow one another, the next immediately chasing the previous one. Now, the Anthropocene, by forcing us to open our eyes to the temporality of the Earth system, is reintroducing the future, a future both immense and threatening, is imposed on us, humans. We, unequally, suffer its effects. But settling for the status of victims would be not enough to exonerate us, since we, having become a geological force, must recognize that we are also, to varying degrees, its agents. We cannot sue the Earth or humankind for crimes against humanity and ecocide. This bursting of the presentist bubble can only further increase the temporal disorientation that was already a widely shared experience. While we could more or less put up with an eclipse of the future, relying on a self-sufficient present, the sudden return of the future, but in the form of an oncoming catastrophe, aroused great anxiety, particularly among younger people who have only known presentisms. This gives rise to a number of reactions, some of them contradictory. Some speak of the mourning of the future. Others, like Greta Thunberg, of the stolen future. Through their indifference and inaction, the older generations are in effect depriving the younger generations of the future to which they are entitled, a right that is therefore unjustly, they thought, denied them. For Bruno, the late Bruno Latour, if we want to have a future, he says, we cannot continue to believe in the old future, precisely that of the modern regime of historicity, the one in which most of the countries of the South have believed and cannot fail to believe. But what new future can we believe in? Another reaction is fear of the future. Already at work, especially in old nations with aging populations, this fear is now being reinforced. The ubiquitous word hunger is sufficient to explain and justify almost everything. The emotional immediacy of social network feeds and amplifies these reactions. In this way, in what way do the temporalities of the Earth system, or to use Deepesh Chakrabarty's expression of the planet, of which we have no direct experience, intervene in the texture of this hybrid time that I call Anthropocene time, understood as the new epoch of time. As we know, neither the scales nor the rhythm between the temporalities of the world and those of the earth can be adjusted. All they have in common is that they are both chronos time, very long or very short, and yet they have an impact on each other, those of the Earth system on the times of the world, and from now on, those of the world on those of the Earth. On the Earth side, there is an additional factor of disorientation, insofar as the temporalities of the Earth system are plural and are not, to take an image, of a single flow. On the contrary, there are thresholds, tipping points, positive feedback loops, feedback effects that reinforce the initial effect, and finally, sudden acceleration and phenomena of irreversibility. Hence, these futures that have not yet happened and are already partly played out. While the Earth's climate has always oscillated, phases of warming succeeding phases of cooling, these oscillations were very slow and remain within certain limits. But today, we can see that as a result of our actions, these limits are being rapidly forced. Once these limits have been exceeded, we enter not only in the unknown, but into the unpredictable, which only increases uncertainty. And it will take millennia for a new equilibrium to be established, whatever we do or don't do. Even if we stop all greenhouse gas emission today, we would already have changed the climate for the next 100,000 years. Nonetheless, decisions need to be taken now, almost day by day, if we want not to go back to before the Anthropocene, or even to stop it, but at the very least, to avoid a catastrophic Anthropocene for humans and non-humans alike. The problem for human beings has always been to articulate the categories of past, present, and future. Depending on the time and place, precedence has been given to the past, the future, or the present. In the time of the Anthropocene, the problem remains, but it has become much more complicated, since there is no longer just a past, but several pasts, and no longer just a future, but several futures, themselves heterogeneous, with different scopes, their own rhythm, and, a further complication, interacting with each other. If we cannot articulate these multiform temporalities, we must at least try to hold them together, even though no new modern time is available to us to flow them into a single river of time, leading to some radiant future. Under these conditions, the task of a history to come could no longer be simply to bridge the gap between past and future, as was once the case, in order to give meaning to the present. Looking at both the world and the planet, it must begin by mapping out all these entangled temporalities, without, however, losing sight of a present placed almost entirely under the sign of urgency alone. A present which oscillates between almost everything and almost nothing. For and try to a new cosmos calls for a new cosmology, and along with it, for a, so to speak, cosmo-history, relying on a cosmochronology which cannot just be some more or less amended universal chronology. It also calls for a reconfigured cosmopolitanism capable of making room for non-humans and humans who, while remaining fully of the world, have become a geological force in their own right. Moreover, the humans are strongly invited to see themselves as no longer occupying the central stage, but rather as a minority. Homo sapiens is some sort of a minority, and microbes seems to represent the majority. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francois. So I'll now hand over to Nick to begin the discussion with Francois.
Okay, thank you very much for those remarks at the beginning. And there are a number of issues that you have raised that I want to address, that I'd like to discuss. One of these is the paradox of the concept of the Anthropocene itself. And then another one after that will be the relationship between presentism, as you've diagnosed it in our present historical understanding, and its relationship to the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is an interesting concept, not least because it implies that, as you pointed out, that humans have become a geological force, which suggests that we are exercising an extraordinary control over the world. And yet, at the same time, the scale of that control is such that we do not feel we are in control of that relationship. And there's a disproportion of scale, but also one of time. And in the sense that geological time unfolds over vast periods far greater than we can really comprehend. And this indeed was one of the reasons that the Union of Geological Sciences rejected the designation Anthropocene as an official geological temporal marker in its meeting of March 2024, even though it recognized the value of the concept in general terms, and especially in relation to environmental thought. But it said the Anthropocene it's too short, and it is not sufficiently demonstrated geologically yet to be officially inscribed in geological time. And of course, the problem is that by the time it is, we may not be extant as a species anymore. But so there's that disproportion between geological time and human time, in which we've become a kind of geological force. But then there's also, and this is very clear, I think, in the responses to what we acknowledge are widely acknowledge are fundamental problems, environmental problems threatening our very existence. And that's the disproportion between this future in which things may play out in certain ways and our in individual lifetimes. So, or between what philosopher Hans Blumenberg calls Weltzeit, the world time, and Lebenszeit, lifetime. And as a species, we've evolved to respond and anticipate to much more immediate problems and respond at a more individual level. It's difficult for us to adapt collectively to um, to um, problems that confront us as a species, especially when they are unfolding in time that doesn't necessarily correspond to individual lifespans. And um, and this leads me to the second question or observation, and that's a presentism itself. Does presentism, precisely by colonizing, as it were, past and future, by making now the central conception of time, does that make it even harder for us to respond to these things, even though we know that they present existential threats to us? And that's something that you pointed out in your book on regimes of historicity, that presentism is concordant with the desires of globalized consumer capitalism, for example. And certainly, I think the presentism that's amplified by social media, which you pointed out in your preliminary remarks, also makes, I mean, obviously that is determined by capitalist powers and serves their needs, but does it also make it more difficult for us to respond collectively? Does it make it more difficult for us to escape that bubble of presentism or presentisms? Because they're, as you point out, they're different. It's not a single temporality, but different ones.
Well, thank you. If I start with the question of presentism, I think that if we agree that there is something like presentism around, it is much harder for us to respond to the temporalities of the Anthropocene, because we were in a way no longer able to take into consideration the future. Well, if we because presentism appeared, as I said, in our societies in Europe around between 1960 and 1970. And it's, first of all, the questioning of the future, which leads to the emphasis on present. So it's a way, it's because the future is was no longer so powerful, so desirable, that present becomes some kind of the last possibility, so to speak, because it was impossible to go back to the predominance of the past. That was no longer an option. We could not go back to the ancient regime of historicity or to the Historia Magistra. And so the present was, in a way, by default, I should say, elected by default. And when you the surge of the Anthropocene was in around 20,000, was all the more a shock for us, because, as I said, the future had more or less disappeared from our horizon. And it's especially true for younger generations who were not, who knew only presentism, who were born in presentism, under presentism. And of course, you have many factors for this importance, this surge of presentism, and the technological one is a very prominent factor. And I think that the new technologies, the information technologies, the digital revolution is fundamentally presentist. And that's what I said, with the nanosecond become the ordinary of stock markets and financial transactions. And so, and of course, social media are completely presentist. If the question of the Anthropocene and your first question of the was about, well, Anthropocene, the temporalities of the Anthropocene, and in a way, the main question with the Anthropocene, whether you agree to use this, to name it Anthropocene or not, and the geologists disagree, and you have this controversy about the recognition as a new epoch or not. Anyway, this encounter with the temporalities of the Earth system, the main feature of this encounter is the discrepancy between the times, the temporalities of the world in which we are used to live and work and think, and these temporalities so great, so long, so huge, that we are unable even to figure out what they are. And the shock between the two is, I think, a great factor of anxiety and disorientation right now. And as I said, I don't think we are able to articulate those different temporalities, those of the world and those of the Earth system, but we are obliged to hold them together without trying, even trying to articulate them, because it's not possible because of the difference of scale. But we have to find a way to hold them together and to respond in a way to these not of heterogeneous temporalities. And that's, I think, the main difficulties in which we are right now.
you mentioned the sense of urgency, but of course, to feel that sense of urgency is to share also the temporal, the same frame of temporal reference as the scientists who are warning about this. And there seem to be 3 or 4 different kinds of responses to the information that scientists are presenting about the Anthropocene or about the dangers that climate change is presenting to us. One is, of course, anxiety. Another is denial, and that seems to be most prominent among the politicians of the world and indeed voters. A third is a kind of utopian hope or expectation that technology will somehow miraculously solve this problem if we just wait long enough. So it's a kind of quietist hope in utopia. And then the last one would be an appropriation of older, familiar apocalyptic scenarios, but now occurring imminently. And some people are, are appropriating these scenarios, and they're thinking, well, this is the end of time. This is so it will either be mapped onto some biblical eschatological scheme, or it will be just a sense of it's hopeless, and this is the end of time, and that's that, without any kind of transcendent intervention or salvation. And so part of the problem seems to be precisely that we have these different responses which involve different kinds of temporalities, but the conflict among them also inhibits unified action.
Yes, and that modern time of this, what I call the modern regime of historicity, is a time with no limits. And one characteristic of the modern time is precisely to have suppressed the limits, the old limits of biblical time, the 6,000 years of the biblical span of time, and suppress the limit with someone like Buffon. The age of the Earth is much older than we thought. Okay, and on the other side, in direction of the future, you have someone like Condorcet, who opens up a future, indefinite future. Okay. So the limits have disappeared, the bounds have disappeared. But with the Anthropocene, you reintroduce a limit, because it might be that the sixth extinction is approaching. That means that when you introduce such a limit, the quality of the time between today and this forthcoming extinction becomes a time of the end. Not yet the end, but a time of the end. And so the quality of time itself changed. And it's not a surprise to meet people, different kinds of apocalypticians, calculating the date of the end. So that's something which was quite present with the Christian time. Mm-hmm. The Christian time, you have this coming of the end, and with the incarnation, in a way, you enter the time of the end, not yet the end, but the time of the end. And with with the Anthropocene, in a way, we are experiencing this situation, which was on a very different ground, because there is no eschatology, no judgment, final judgment, and so on. But we experience it in terms of time properly. We are experiencing something which was the situation of Europe during many centuries.
I mean, it's in some ways it seems that the limit that the Anthropocene, the concept of the Anthropocene, is imposing on us is a kind of reversal of what happened in early Christianity, which was an apocalyptic religion. It was expecting the imminent end of time. And of course, when that didn't happen, it then became necessary to postulate a future that is increasingly indefinite. And the modern regime of history, as you call it, is characterized precisely by the idea of an open and indefinite future. Now we're having to confront a future that may be temporally uncertain, but the effects that it have are not so uncertain. And neither the modern regime of history with its open future nor presentism has prepared us for that.
No, not at all.
And so you can revert to the apocalyptic formulas, but it doesn't. They're not going to they're going to be disappointing too. So
yeah, but even if you have people using some kind of apocalyptic tone or apocalyptic perspective, they are not really real apocalypticians, because for them, apocalypse is the end, complete end. And of course, in the Christian or in the Judaism, apocalypse is the end of something and the beginning of something quite new, totally new. So even on the concept of apocalypse, they don't understand what was apocalypse in the previous Judaism or Christian vision of.
Okay, I want to close this discussion by, first of all, for those who are not familiar with François Hartog's work, and especially the regime of historicity, I'll give you his own definition of it, which is these are the modalities of self-consciousness that every society adopts in its constructions of time and its perceptions, and more specifically, the sense in which a society reflects upon the relationship between past, present, and future, so that the regime of historicity then is a concept that can be applied to different kinds of understandings of history. It doesn't apply a single concept, but it applies different ones, and in that sense is a meta-historical concept. And now you're suggesting we're moving from the presentist one, or the presentist one is being confronted with the problems of the Anthropocene. And so we're in this period of transition, which is naturally going to be attended with great anxiety because we don't have an alternative model yet. We're still struggling. And the question I wanted to ask you is something you mentioned in an article called The Texture of History, the Texture of the Present, that was published in English translation in 2022. And you said that what we need to do is take a step back, a distancing from our temporal understanding, observing the present as if we were not in it.
Yeah.
And you say observing the earth as if we were not on it. So that it's a double distancing. And I just wondered if you could say a little more about that and how that might take place.
Well, it's of course it's I'm using some kind of image, but I think that it's a more an attempt to deal with this specific difficulty we mentioned earlier in our conversation. That is this deep discrepancy between presentism, the presentist bubble in which we are, and the temporalities of the Anthropocene, the Earth, the temporalities of the Earth. And so a way to try to, as I said, to be able to hold them, these temporalities, so heterogeneous together, is to try to step back in a way, and to say, what if I may I step back from the, in a way, to get out of the bubble for a while, and to look at the Earth as if I was not part of it. And that's, so that is, it's not different from what I said in my presentation. It's an only using this image of trying to be an outsider for a while. It's
Okay.
another way to say the same thing.
Thank you very much. I think probably we'll want to open it up now to questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you so much, Francois and Nick. That was fascinating. So we have quite a few questions lined up already, but for those of you who are tuned in live, please do continue to send your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So I'd like to begin with a question from Alice, who asks, please, can you clarify why presentism may be more anxiety-inducing than other ways of understanding history? What are people looking for from historical accounts that will minimize their anxiety when considering human life in a historical context?
Okay, I think that when we were in what I call the modern regime of historicity, history was future-oriented, and in a way, it was I said with Tocqueville, in a way it was, you had the capacity to look at the past and to know what was important to retain. And because you had this vision of the future, so that in the modern regime of historicity, as I said, the light comes from the future and illuminates the present and the past. So you more or less know where you are, where you stand, and where you go, and where you come from. When the light disappears, when the future is no longer does no longer shed light on the present and the past, you are in darkness. And presentism, from this point of view, does not offer you a vision of what are you going to retain in the past, because you don't know where you go when you look at in the direction of the future. So the past becomes obscure or disappear in a way, and a way to cope with this situation was to rely on memory, and to make in 1980 in Europe and also in the US, but memory became the main the main the main category, and memory, at the difference of history, memory does not with memory you look at the past or some moments of the past and you bring them, you evoke them, you bring them in the present, but there is no opening in direction of the future. So memory and and we have also commemoration and heritage and all these things so important in our society in the last 40 years are manifestation are linked rather to presentism. They are not necessarily presentist, but they are linked to presentism, and they are a way to escape presentism, but to deal also with presentism.
So we have another question from Anne, which is Patrick Deenan, author of Why Liberalism Failed and Regime Change, has also identified presentism as a problem, but one he characterizes as a feature, not a bug, of liberalism, insofar as presentism, deracination from past and future, enables, inter alia, consumerism. Do you agree, or is your notion of presentism different?
I'm not sure to get the whole question.
So I'll repeat it. Patrick Deenan, author of Why Liberalism Failed and Regime Change, has also identified presentism as a problem.
Yes.
He characterizes as a feature, not a bug, of liberalism, insofar as presentism, deracination from past and future, enables consumerism. Do you agree, or is your notion of presentism different?
Yes, I agree. Presentism and consumerism are linked, and but in my view, but maybe I'm wrong, liberalism is not necessarily presentist. I think at least at the beginning of liberalism, the liberalism was quite open in direction of the future, was futurist in that sense, and it changed because our relations to time change, and so that it adapts to presentism. I would say that's rather an adaptation to presentism, that rather than to see liberalism as fundamentally presentist. But maybe it's not the case, but that's what I would say.
So Nick, do you feel free to jump in as well if you would like to add anything to these answers? So the next question is from Jorg, who says, can you elaborate a bit on your concept of cosmo-history and its implied connection to a new cosmopolitanism or cosmopolitics? What's the difference between geohistory, world history, and cosmo-history?
Okay, I would be glad to be able to elaborate on this proposition, but that's something, that's an idea I am proposing, I am putting into discussion. I think that the direction in which it would be interesting to move, to what might be a cosmo-history. And I think that it would be an history which had the capacity to take into account these entangled temporalities we have been discussing, these temporalities of the world, the ordinary temporality of the world, so to speak, which are themselves different, sometimes contradictory, quite often in conflict. So that's one thing. And on the other side, we have to take into consideration the temporalities of the earth, and which are themselves plural and heterogeneous also, with different rhythm, as I said briefly. So all these entangled temporalities are would be an element in the elaboration of a cosmo-history. And this cosmo-history who has to deal not only with humans, but equally with non-humans. And that's something which is now quite obvious, I think. And that's the reason why I finish my presentation by this notion of humans have to be conscious that they are in the whole universe, that they are only minority, and they can no longer behave as if they were a majority. So that's some indication of what might be a cosmo history.
So we have a question from Ebru, who asks, can we experience presentism in a way which allows us to respond quicker to climate crisis, as the implication would be that the problem is urgent and reaction must be fast? In other words, is there possibly a good presentism that can reorient us towards the three time categories of past, present, and future simultaneously, which would allow what you are suggesting about considering multiple temporalities all at once to understand what it means to live in the Anthropocene?
Okay. Is there a good presentism? At first glance, no. Because presentism is unable to take into consideration duration and the climate issues cannot be solved in a second. And that's one of, I think, of the difficulties of the moment, because people think that if things are not solved right now, you are doing nothing. And one characteristic of presentism is this inability to take into to grasp, to deal with, or to deal with duration. That's on one side. But presentism might be also the recognition of what I call in my book, Chronos, kairos. So the decisive moment, the right moment, the to do something or to move or so you have to, that might be, if you take presentism as kairos, that might be what we might call a good presentism, this ability to recognize the kairos. And for example, Bruno Latour, the late Bruno Latour, was saying that the epidemic of COVID might be seen as a kairos. And when he said that, it means the occasion of doing things completely differently. So to use the moment in order to change radically our way of our behavior. So that might be the capacity of recognize the kairos in the present.
Would you like to add anything to that, Nick?
Yes, I would. To come back to the issue of the cosmo-histories, I think the crucial thing in developing this will be the problem that discussed earlier, and that is overcoming a kind of disproportion between the sense of the individual time, individual lifetime, and larger spans of earthly time. And I confess, in other words, between Lebenszeit and Weltzeit, and that's absolutely essential, I think, for this to succeed. So we can't assume that our lifetime or our individual concerns in the present are the only ones. And in fact, that they are always implicated in larger patterns of time, larger movements, as Monsieur Hartog said, that we are not, in fact, the majority, we are a minority on the planet we are occupying temporarily. And but I think the only way that this can be accomplished really is mythically rather than rationally. I'm just not convinced that we are now in a position in which rational thought is capable, especially given the modern media, the presentist media ecology. Rationality, I think, has very little chance. And so if this is going to happen, it has to happen, I think, via mythic means, through storytelling and that kind of thing. And that will be, I think, where, if there is any hope, that's where it will have to lie. But...
And who will do it on a mythic line? Who is going to do it to produce this mythic work?
That's a good question. I think that the scientists and others will have to contribute, because there are always going to be counter myths, and we already have that. I mean, Donald Trump is very good at producing counter myths. So I think those of us who are concerned about it will have to generate these somehow. But it's there is going to be, I think, a kind of battle of myths, and the traditional forms of historiography, I don't think, are going to be successful in this contestation.
Okay.
So I think we have time for just one more question. So this final question is from Alexandre, who asks, when Hartog spoke of bursting the presentist bubble earlier, does he have in mind the philosophical idea that only present things exist? Or is he referring to the tendency to interpret the past in present terms? And also, to what extent are we actually entitled to a future, as he claimed?
Well, I'm not saying that the past does not exist, and that we are closed in our presentist bubble, as if the presentist bubble was the only reality. But but the question, the history has always dealt with the relations between past and present, and as I said, you have several ways to do it. To do that, either you look at the past as a reservoir of examples and lessons, and that's what the case with this what I call the ancient regime of historicity, where the past in the leading category, the light comes from the past, and that's one way. The other way is the one defined by Tocqueville, when the future, so it's no longer the past, but the future will become the main category, and the light comes from the future. So in order to you write history through the light of the future, and you see what you want, which you have to retain in the past. And of course, when you write, you go the other way around. You move from the past in direction of the future, but in fact, you start from the future in order to write your history. And when the light coming from the future has also disappeared, you are in a situation where the present remain at the only one category, and it's how it becomes very difficult to write history in such a new configuration. And the Anthropocene introduce a new, totally new, unexpected configuration, where you have suddenly an immense future coming, and you have also an immense past, and you have to deal with this enormous span of times in order to try to understand where you are, where you stand, and what can you do.